critical social, that's where the critical social processes were taking place.
So disaggregated, that's one piece of what you mean by meso.
Right.
That it's disaggregated locations of social activity. Another point that I think you've made in your writings frequently enough is that for most social processes, there isn't just one theme. There are multiple kind of sources.
Right.
So you might imagine that there was also a business community that was militantly arguing against a boycott and trying to mobilize people around its vision of let's keep this economy going, we're better off today than we were yesterday, and this is just going to screw everything up, and all these radicals are trying to get us to do stuff we don't want to do. In other words, a kind of a counter meaningful effort to demobilize people.
Sure.
And that must be a common feature of contention.
Absolutely. I mean, again, that's another sort of objection I have to what I see as a tendency towards increasingly narrow social movement scholarship. What I earlier said was sort of a Ptolemaic view of the world that has movements sort of as the center of the universe, and then lesser bodies like things called the state, you know, kind of floating at the very margins of the system, the solar system. You know, instead of studying social movements, we should study episodes of contention or something like that. And invariably, movements are embedded in a very complicated field of actors, and the composition of the field changes over time. New actors, you know, become salient; others fall away. And so, absolutely, and that was true in Montgomery. There were a number of active forces seeking to shape the conflict as it unfolded. This is one of the rare cases where the movement actors essentially prevailed, not just in convincing the vast majority of the black community to conform to the terms of the boycott, requirements of the boycott, but ultimately prevailed in the struggle with the Montgomery City Council, and, you know, and the bus company, and so forth. But there are many, many, many. I mentioned earlier the 20 cases that we're just looking at of community response to these citing decisions. And again, in most of the cases, the vast majority of the cases, the ultimate outcome of the review process is really in the hands of the developers of the project, that is capital, if you will, and state authorities at different levels of government, and the movement actors, to the extent that they're there at all, which in many cases they're not, play a very peripheral role. So again, if you identify the movement as the center of the universe, and you essentially start the Montgomery story, say, or the civil rights story in Montgomery in '55, you've totally misspecified the broader dynamics you should be paying attention to. All of the contention over race that we associate with the civil rights movement, that episode was set in motion by the Cold War. The Cold War renationalized the issue of race. The federal government could afford to say nothing on the issue until the end of World War II. So Franklin Roosevelt, arguably the most popular president in the history of the United States, governing for much of his term in office in a progressive period in the U.S., surrounded by liberal left advisors, maybe electorally invulnerable, but the margins he won by were just incredible, never said a word on civil rights reform, even though he was lobbying intensively to do so. But he didn't want to antagonize the white South, which was critical to the electoral coalition, the New Deal electoral coalition, but also Southern senators, because they generally ran unopposed, were the most senior senators, and same with the congressmen. And so he had to play ball with them because they were the committee chairs, okay? So he didn't say a word. Well, why did Truman? There's a big puzzle. Why did Truman, who's electorally vulnerable, not super popular, you know, why does he embrace the need for civil rights reform in a very significant way? And indeed, he does antagonize the white South. But why is he acting? He's acting because of the Cold War. Jim Crow racism, American-style racism, is a horrible foreign policy liability, given the superpower competition that emerges almost immediately at the end of World War II. So what opens the whole issue up and begins to embolden civil rights forces is the kind of federal embrace, at least rhetorical embrace, of the need for civil rights reform. And then you set in motion a titanic struggle between the Southern Dixiecrats, certain federal officials, and civil rights forces who, again, are recognizing an opportunity when they see one. But to start at Montgomery and tell that story, it's like, all you need is courage. Rosa Parks was just tired of sitting, you know. That's, again, that's not a compelling account of the civil rights movement. That doesn't discount her heroism, her importance to the struggle, but you've got to embed this in a broader context and bring other actors into sharp focus if we're going to understand the kind of dynamic, interactive processes that shape that unfolding episode.
Now, what's interesting about that point is that we began by contrasting the macro to the meso. And the point was, your point was that it's really important to kind of break down into the more disaggregated processes, which, you know, in some sense constitute the macro, but that's where the action is. It's like the disaggregated processes. But I think you're now extending that in a really interesting way, and that is to say that once you're at the meso level, you also have to pay attention to the kind of pertinent context.
Right.
And that if you break the context, then there's going to be a part of it that a part of the story you're just not understanding at all.
Yeah, I think you really distort history. You have a very truncated understanding of very complicated multi-actor processes. So, yeah, I think you want to zoom in at the meso level, and then you want to widen your frame, because all of the key actors I'm talking about there were operating at what I think of as the meso level. So Truman, first of all, the diplomatic corps and the State Department, they're the ones who first begin to press Truman to come out in favor of civil rights reform, because the diplomatic corps are getting beat up overseas over American-style racism. But these are, you know, what's going on is intense kind of policy conversations within the upper echelon or upper reaches of the State Department. But these are small groups of people acting. They put pressure on Truman. Truman within the administration, they begin to understand the need to violate this 75-year kind of hands-off policy with respect to race, issue of race. But again, these are small groups of actors. Okay, so they're meso. The Dixiecrats are horrified that one of their own, Harry Truman, has violated this understanding, this federal Southern understanding with respect to race, that this is a regional matter. And they decide that they're going to create a third party, the States' Rights Party, and they're going to run Strom Thurmond, who dies in office only 6 years or whatever, at 102. In any case, they decide they're going to create a third party and run Strom Thurmond. But again, that's a small group of individuals, kind of leading segregationists, who are going to lead the charge against Truman. And similarly, we've talked about Montgomery. That's another disaggregated meso-level process. So the key actors are not operating at the micro. These are not macro processes. But again, I think the meso is the right level. But if you only say let's meso in its movement, let's just focus our lens on the movement and let's watch it in time and watch what it does, you're missing the broader context in which it's making choices about what it's choosing to do, and who it's interacting with, and how much power to shape events those other